It's been a long time since we had this much snow and ice here in the Netherlands, but today it has started to thaw. And not far from here is a field, an open field, where kids build at least 30 snowmen. And today they're looking a little bit sad. They are starting to fall apart. And you know what? That is the perfect metaphor of some of my ideas that I spoke about last week in this video series. But before I talk about that, let me first introduce you in case you don't know me. I'm Father Roderick. I'm a priest and I am an author, an aspiring, well, no, actually I am an author. I have already written some stuff, but they're not published yet. So I still suffer a lot from that imposter syndrome. But anyway, I talk in this series about my writing endeavors, about story ideation, about all the aspects of storytelling, writing, and publishing. And in my last video, I spoke about my plans for 2026. Very ambitious plans. If you recall, I spoke about this ideal plan of writing 8 books, or at least publishing 8 books in 2026, and I sketched a whole schedule on how I was planning on doing this. And then I wrote an article based on that, published it on social media, and I got quite a bit of pushback, most importantly from a couple of friends who are fellow authors, but with much more experience than I have. And they all were pushing back in the same way. They were like, this shouldn't be a race, you know. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. And aren't you afraid that if you only push yourself to generate a maximum output, aren't you afraid to skip the steps of editing and revision? Maybe it's better to write 1 good book in a year than to write 8 mediocre or even bad ones. And first of all, that is very, very valid pushback, and I can see why they are reacting like this, because I think that the way I came across in that previous video and the subsequent article was like, oh, I'm going to write 8 new books, but that is not the reason that I recorded the video, and that is not the plan. So let's talk about the plan first. When I said I was going to produce, let's put it that way, 8 books, I was mostly talking about publishing 8 books. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to write 8 books from scratch. Last year was my first year of writing, and I managed to write the equivalent of 7 books in terms of word count. It doesn't say anything about the quality, obviously, or about the form or shape. What did become clear to me was that my storytelling revolves around this kind of Celtic universe where storytelling is a form of magic, and magic itself is basically is rooted in storytelling. And so the stories that I started to imagine were all about, it's getting very slippery here, look at all that ice. The stories all revolved around this type of magic, how it came about, and then over time that world became more and more clear to myself by writing all sorts of stories in that same universe. I got a pretty good grip on the world that I was creating. And it soon became also clear that I wanted everything to kind of be related to one another. However, I did want to try my hand at different genres. And so the first book that I wrote was a very classic epic fantasy story about young monks and nuns that discover this storytelling magic, and then all the complications in the story after that. But then I wrote another book that is much more procedural. So it's a bit like a cops drama. And it was written, I was thinking of like, what could I write in such a way that it could be serialized so that I can publish this almost chapter by chapter. And so that is based on a very different type of storytelling inspired by television series and television writing. And that, of course, is something that I haven't done before either, but I do have a lot of passive experience in the consumption of these stories. So that was a revelation. It was so much fun to write those stories. And because every chapter was basically a new episode, it also gave me license to develop the world and the overall plot as I went. So this was my first try at discovery writing, and I loved it. I totally loved it. Then I went back to the medieval world, and I wrote a prequel, which started as an idea for basically a giveaway book, like a booklet, almost a novella, about the father of the protagonist of my first novel. And I got so immersed in that world and in that story, and it had so much more potential than I thought, that turned into my biggest book so far. That was more than 100,000 words. I wrote it in 1 month, about 3,000 to 4,000 words per day, all recorded, dictated here in the woods during my walks. I always go on these daily walks, like 2.5 hour, and then the ideas just start flowing. So I narrate the story as I go, and then later on I kind of start editing that and revise it. And then I wrote a whole bunch of short stories, and all those short stories, if you add them all up, that is enough for I think 3 or 4 novels in total. And I also came up with a frame story so that all these short stories could fit into a bigger narrative, which is also tied to the universe that I created. But I think the main reason that I started to write those short stories is that after writing the first book, or the first draft, I should say, of the first book, I became painfully aware of how bad I was at writing, how bad I was at storytelling. There were just so many hurdles to overcome. It took me 6 months to write that first draft. And the total amount of words for that one, and I know it's not about quantity, and yet it was only 40,000 words. That is like on the verge of, like, between novella and novel. Definitely not enough for the genre, for an epic fantasy. So I knew after finishing that, I realized I have so much to learn about storytelling. And so also because I was so relieved that first book was done, but also very much aware that it probably is terrible, that I stepped back. I didn't want to reread it. I just knew that I had to start small. And so I, encouraged also by fellow authors who all said, start writing short stories. It's so much fun. You learn so much. I started to write all these short stories, but it was also a form of procrastination. I was just afraid to go back to that first novel. Long story short, at the end of the year, I had all these drafts, the best of which is actually the one I think I wrote in December, also on a daily schedule. Is kind of like feels like a sprint, where like for 1 month you think, you breathe, you sleep in the world of your novel. So I wrote that cozy fantasy. It was exhausting. It was very, very challenging, but at the same time, I think it's probably the most finished draft that I wrote. But none of those drafts have been polished, revised. And I think for the short stories, that's not such a big issue. But for the big stories, obviously, they need to have several rounds of revisions and the whole editorial process. That is completely new to me. But I know it's part of the learning process. And as you know, that's why I'm doing this. I know that I will only be a good writer years from now. But iteration, just keep on writing, keep on storytelling. Every story that I tell gets better because I learn more. And I see what doesn't work, and I know which skills I have to acquire and study. So that's why I do this. But I know that the editorial process is the next big step for me. That brings me to the last video. So what that was is actually, first of all, it was a plan to push myself through that editorial process. It's very hard for me to write in a void. You know, I love sharing the stories, and I feed on the feedback that I get. That's part of the way in which I learn how to write stories. It's the same in church when I have a homily. I like it when people react, when they, even if it's just with their eyes or with their smile or with their frowns, it gives me so much feedback that makes the story that I'm telling better. And so I didn't see myself like working for an indeterminate amount of time on the revision process and the editorial process. I just know that I won't have the stamina to do that. And so that's how I came up with that plan. Like, well, what if I take a set number of months, and that may be a little bit of mine because I'm on the spectrum. I like systems. And so I was like, oh, you know what? I could spend 2 months of revisions and editing on that first book, and then do another sprint, because I like to create new stuff as well. It keeps me creative, and I don't want to put my discovery writing on hold for an entire year while I'm editing. I can't do that. But I was thinking, okay, so two months on that first draft of that first book, and then we'll do 2 months on the Dragon Patrol series, and then we'll go back to the prequel that I wrote, etc. So those 8 books are not 8 books written from scratch, but they're actually more of a way for me to hold myself account, or make myself accountable to my audience. And just this is what I discovered about what works for me, for my brain, is that the fact that I have that deadline where I know that, you know, one day from now, this needs to get out. It gives me the amount of adrenaline, dopamine that pushes me through, that motivates me. If I don't have that, I'll start procrastinating. And I don't want to ever get to the point where writing feels like a chore, where it creates too much friction. And so having this very simple division of the year into like longer periods, like 2 months, and then 1 month of creative writing, and then back to 2 months of editing, and then back to 1 month of creative writing, it just feels right. But what the last thing I wanted to convey, and unfortunately I think that I didn't make that clear enough, was this is not advice for everyone. I'm not telling anyone that you should write more or write as many books as I want to write, because that would be totally unrealistic. Everyone has a different writing process. You've got the plotters and the pantsers, and the in between people like me. You've got people that polish every sentence, every word, and you got people who just like can write 10,000 words in 2 days, and that's all good as long as people tell stories. Then that's fine. And even the revision process, I think, is different for most authors. I know that for me, and this is because I have a very strong suspicion that I am very much an ADHDer. So I thrive on challenges. I thrive on sprints. I thrive on feedback. Those are all moments of little amounts of dopamine, just enough to get me over the next hurdle. And I know this because that's what I've been doing last year. For an entire year, I was able to figure out, without suffering the consequences, what worked. And I am so glad that I never was tempted to publish the stories that year. And because I knew that this was all about not just discovery writing in the sense that let's discover the world that I want to create or the characters. No, this was discovery writing in the sense that I am discovering myself as a writer. What kind of a writer am I? What are the storytelling forms that work for me, and what kind of workflow suits me best? So that is why I set that goal, and I know the thumbnail of the video was a bit clickbaity, 8 books, but that was more because I know that if I share these plans, it motivates me. Because I put it out there, I just share it, so it helps me to take myself more seriously. But also, a side effect is that it invites debate and feedback, and that I've always welcomed that, because especially if it's from fellow writers, because they have so much more experience. They've been where I've been, and what I like is that they all say, well, you know what? I wouldn't do it that way, or my method is this and my method is that. That is why I've done all these author interviews over the past few months. It's because I love to learn from other writers how they write, and then I kind of take the things that work for me. But yeah, that video was not for aspiring writers trying to convince them to write 8 books. No. If you can, sure, by all means. But the most important thing is, it's not about quantity. I would even say it's not immediately about quality either. It's about creating a writing habit. It's give yourself any motivation that you can find to tell stories and to keep telling them and to keep improving on those stories. By now, I feel like I'm walking in a river, literally. I'm so glad I've got my walking boots on, because this road, which was all snowy, but right now it's just one river of molten snow, and it's all getting very muddy. Anyway, so, but just like those snowmen that were standing proud in this field over there in the distance, when the weather changes, they adapt and they change as well. And that's true also for my plans. And so over the past few days, I've been thinking about this plan, and would it be feasible? Is this actually the best thing to do? And the most important thing for me was, where do I start? What's going to be my project for these next 2 months? And that's where I am still not decided. I don't like it because time is ticking. I'm recording this on the 9th of January, so I feel like, 1/3 of the month is already gone. What am I doing? Come on. But at the same time, what I wanted to know is, does it make sense to start with that first novel that I wrote last year? And so what I did today was I started reading my own novel, that first draft. And this is the first time since I went to Ireland to finish the draft. And I started to read the first chapter. Oh, it's so bad. It is so, it is really, really, really bad. And it came a bit as a shock, because that is a chapter that I rewrote at least 10 times. And it's so bad. It's really, immediately I knew I shouldn't judge myself. It's supposed to be bad. This was my first ever writing effort. It by definition has to be bad. But what it also taught me was, whoa, I could not write something that bad now, a year later. I even if I tried to, I just couldn't. Because I don't know, I have a different way of storytelling now. But then I started to read the second and the third chapter. I was a little bit reassured. I was like, okay, I still see a lot of elements that I still think work. The way in which they are written, the prose is pretty bad. There's almost no good character description. Dialogue is terrible. But that's all fixable. What I think I see is that this story still has the potential that I saw in it when I started to write it. However, we're not talking about some light edits and then put it out. What this is going to require is a true rewrite. But it's the first book, so that's okay. But it does, I'm already thinking while I'm reading the story, like, but why didn't I start like this? Or what if this could happen? So And since I know the world so much better now because I wrote that prequel, so I understand kind of the context much better than even my protagonist knows at the start of this book. I think that a rewrite is perfectly fine. And but what I do like is that the main premise of the book still stands. So that's reassuring. Now, does that mean that this is the wisest project to tackle? Because this wouldn't just be refinements, as I said. There's going to be a rewrite. And I don't know if that is the smart thing to do at the start of this year. Other options, I'm just putting it out there. I'm sharing it as I go. I just, before I pressed record, started to think about this. Another option would be to continue the story of Katie and Henry and Matthew and Trissy from the cozy fantasy novel that I wrote in December. Why? Because I still am very much in that story and in that world. And when I was writing the final chapter, my brain was already coming up with, I know what's going to happen next. And as I explained in a previous video, the idea for me would be to write 4 in one series. And each story, it's about the same characters, same world, but they all take place in a different time of the year. I love the challenge of writing cozy fantasy that takes place in the springtime instead of in the winter or in the fall, which is kind of the go-to season for most of the cozy fantasy. And so I had a couple of, I think, great ideas about what could happen in the spring novel as well as the summer. I don't know about the fall, but definitely springtime and summer. I think, the main premise of the story. And that's all I need. And now I can continue to write. So that would be an alternative. That would mean, because those cozy fantasy novels are still, in my mind at least, they're not really serious. They're just, again, ways in which I can just train myself to write better. I like the fact that it's more contained as a genre. So this is something that ideally I would continue to write in sprints, so on a monthly basis. So that would, if I were to do that, ideally I would just go for finishing the entire series in the first quarter of this year. And so to just take the month of January to write the spring novel, and then in February and March write summer and fall, and then I would have a full series. There are lots of advantages in doing that. I don't have to completely reboot my creative process because it's much more of a continuous story that I'm telling, and I know the characters, and I don't know. There's just a lot that's already cooking that I think could work. So that's another option. Dragon Patrol, as tempting as it is, I think that still needs to mature a little bit. But since Katie and her friends live in the same time and the same world as Dragon Patrol, it can still help me to start, to continue developing those bigger stories about Dragon Patrol. So, anyway, so if I were to do that, it does change the plans from the last video. But, a plan is just like a snowman. If the weather changes, maybe it changes too. You just have to go with the flow, especially if you're melting, right? Love to hear your thoughts. The final thing is, obviously, is this idea of serializing my writing. So I did a lot of research looking at successful existing projects, so people that write on a weekly basis, and I'm still very enamored by it. But I also realized that it works differently. If you want to do serialized writing, you have to think differently. It's more like a TV show. So Dragon Patrol, I think, would be much more suitable for this genre than my medieval novels. So as long as I don't know for sure what I'm doing, I'll just keep I'll just keep sitting on that egg until it hatches, and you'll be the first to know. So thank you so much. Keep following if you are interested in this process, and by all means, let me know your thoughts, your ideas, your wish list, and feedback as well. Absolutely welcome all your knowledge, your wisdom, and your experience as well. So thanks so much for watching, and keep telling those stories. Talk to you soon.